Alright guys, so the Raw Therapee videos continue, and I'm going to start going through here tab by tab. So you see, I've showed you the file browser, and I've showed you around the periphery of the editor here, just the kind of housekeeping stuff and UI kind of stuff, but now we're going to go through the actual editing tools, and they are over here, and you see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tabs. There's what they call the exposure tab, the detail tab, the color tab, the advanced tab, the transform tab, the raw tab, and the metadata tab. And today we're going to look at the exposure tab, and hopefully it won't take too long. But before we get into it, I just want to, I might have made this kind of disclaimer before, but if I haven't, or anyway, I want to do it again, just so everybody knows. Like, I am not a developer of Raw Therapee or any kind of an expert. I'm just somebody who uses it, and I've used it for about 1.5 years now. So don't make the mistake of thinking that I'm coming at you from some kind of position of authority. I'm just trying to share what I learn, and just hopefully if people want to get started with Raw Therapee, this might help them do it a bit quicker. But take what I say with a grain of salt, right? And you have to read Rawpedia, the user guide, and play around with it yourself, right? Like, I can't tell you what to do with your photos, right? You have to do what you think is right. So I just want to put that disclaimer out there. Like, don't make the mistake of thinking that I have some kind of authority about this, or that I have some kind of inside track on what to do, right? But I'm just trying to share. And also, if you see me doing something that you think is maybe wrong, or if you have a different way of doing it or something like that, by all means leave a comment. Like, I'm hoping that we can all learn from each other, and I'm learning this free software workflow, right? Like, it's new to me too, so we can all learn from each other is what I mean, right? And with that in mind, I hope that disclaimer is clear enough, right? Anyway, with that in mind, I'd like to mention that and do a little housekeeping thing, and it comes from a comment from this guy Jose Juarez, and he says he mentions Andy Astbury's tutorials, which I've mentioned before, and anybody interested in Raw Therapee should definitely check them out. He has some great tutorials, and he mentions this histograms up here, because last time I said this show hide RGB indicator bar that I didn't know what it was for, but I've actually seen it before, and Jose's comment reminded me that if you hover your mouse cursor over the picture, it will show up there under the histogram in that bar the RGB values, and it looks like the lightness value too, yeah, of that particular spot in the picture. So there you go, that's what that does. And Jose also mentioned another really cool tip that I never tried before. Like, I mean, obviously I haven't gone through every feature in Raw Therapee, right? Like, this is some deep stuff. And anyway, he said that here in this preferences, you open up preferences down here, general, editor layout, and the default here is a single editor tab mode, vertical tabs, but you can change it to multiple editor tabs in one window, in own window, right? So you'd open up a bunch of windows, but I'm going to change it to multiple editor tabs and click OK. And now I have to restart Raw Therapee for that to take effect. I've got Rawpedia open here. So let me start up Raw Therapee again. And you'll see that now, when I open a picture in the editor, see, things have changed. Everything's up here now. And when I double click this, it opens in a tab here, and I can go back to the file browser over here, and I could open another picture. And I've opened up a bunch of pictures in this since Jose's comment there, and it seems like I can open up a whole bunch of them and things work, right? So anyway, cool. I'm gonna work this way for today, and I might work this way all the time from now on. Anyway, thanks, Jose. That's a good tip there. And you could also have them open up in their own windows, right? Okay, so anyway, with that out of the way, all that out of the way, today's the exposure tab, and we're gonna start up here. Now, someday I'm gonna have to do a different video about these processing profiles up here, but I'm not going to get into that. I'm gonna do the exposure tab, right? So here's a picture. This is the way it opens up at the default. This picture was taken on a Canon 70D with a Canon 50mm f2.5 macro lens, and it's like, I think it's pretty sharp, and it's good because it has blacks and whites, and it's good for demonstrating this exposure tab. It's a picture of a slug eating a mushroom, and you can see his mouth eating it, which is cool, I think. So anyway, at the exposure tab, right, you can click auto levels. I basically never do this, but you can hit auto levels, and I don't like it. And this clip percent is related to auto levels, so you could change the amount of colors that are allowed to clip, but I don't use auto levels. And I forgot to mention last time, with your history over here, you can click at previous steps and go back to them, obviously, right? So anyway, I don't bother with the auto levels. I do, highlight reconstruction might be off by default, might be on depending on the picture, but I turn it on. And for highlight reconstruction, you know, you can turn on this clipped highlight indicator. If the picture has no clipped highlights, don't bother with this highlight compression here. Probably don't bother with highlight reconstruction, because these are for bringing back, restoring blown highlights. The highlights tool down here is for darkening highlights that are not blown, right? So if you don't have blown highlights, don't use this. If you do have some blown highlights, use the color propagation method and just drag up highlight compression until your blown highlights disappear. Now, with the color propagation method, if your highlights are really badly blown, you're doing some really heavy duty highlight recovery, it can screw up. It can cause, like, you know, false color. Like if you're bringing back highlights, you might even see a teeny bit of false color there, but it's no big deal in this picture. But like if you had a whole sky blown out and you drag this up, it might, you know, if there's nothing there, the color propagation might make things magenta or something. It will look bad, and you don't want to use it, right? Color propagation is computationally bleeding nearby colors into the blown highlight areas to recover them. So like in really extreme cases, the effect isn't good, and in those cases you would want to use some different method of these four, like luminance recovery, Scilab blending, or blend. And there's descriptions of them on Rawpedia. I find the descriptions not that important. Like if these highlights were not recovered well, if they were turning gross, I would just click through and find the one that is least gross. And with any method other than color propagation, they don't recommend you drag this highlight compression up higher than around 100. So basically, if highlight compression isn't working, you might have a hard time recovering the blown highlights, depending on the picture. I've had varied experience. Some you can try, like luminance recovery or blend or something might work and just bring them back to a little bit less blown out, but it's not going to like recover, you know, the missing clouds and stuff in a sky in the way that color propagation would, right? So if your highlights are gone, they might just be gone. Hear me drinking here. This is coffee. I'm not on the beer tonight. So anyway, that's your highlight compression, right? And I usually do that first, and then there's exposure compensation, and this is pretty typical. You know, you can adjust the exposure compensation, and depending on your camera and the ISO and whatnot, who knows how far you'll be able to take this, right? Like, you know, some cameras don't like to go more than about a stop of exposure compensation either direction. Some can do more than 3 stops, right? So that depends on your camera, and hopefully your exposure is good to begin with. But good thing about shooting raw is you can adjust it, and this, I find this works fine. And then there's blacks, and I'll turn off the highlight indicator, turn on the blacks indicator, and you can increase blacks or decrease blacks and see the effect in this overlay if you want. I often just click them up 1 or 2 clicks just to equalize the histogram, if that makes sense. And then there's shadow compression. I pretty much never use this. Like, there's a shadows thing down here, but yeah, I'm not sure about that. I'm not a big shadows guy. I try not to mess with the shadows that much. I shoot Canon. There's lightness. Lightness adjusts the lightness of the picture, obviously, but it's different from your exposure compensation up here in that the lightness, no matter how high you take it, shouldn't it shouldn't affect, like, it shouldn't push the histogram out of range on either side, no matter what you do. Whereas the exposure compensation, you could probably just, yeah, you see, you could push the histogram all off out of range, right? And with lightness, that doesn't happen. So they're a bit different. I usually play around with a combination of both. But usually I set the highlight compression if needed, the exposure compensation if needed, the blacks. And then lightness, contrast, and saturation, pretty obvious what they do. And you can play with these now, but I often come back to these to finish up after I've done other adjustments. And it's pretty obvious what they do, right? And saturation is not nearly the only color control, right? And contrast too. I don't get too involved with contrast at that point, because there's curves here, and this is one of the main things we're going to be looking at today. A lot of the other stuff is pretty basic, but the curves here are pretty amazing, right? So Raw Therapee has, you see, tone curve 1, tone curve 2. There's 2 curves. And there's Automatch tone curve, and this is the Automatch tone curve, you see? You can turn that off just by, like, reset it to linear with this little arrow. And that's, like, with no curve. And go back to the Automatch tone curve. The Automatch tone curve is trying to match your camera's JPEG, or the JPEG that's embedded in the RAW file. And I often just leave it. You don't have to. Like, if you're really getting involved in processing a picture, you probably want to reset this and do it yourself. But if you're doing a bunch of pictures, the Automatch curve is usually pretty good. I often just leave it and adjust the second curve. But another thing I would often do is, like, brighten this without adding too much contrast, without changing it much, just brighten it all a bit, and then darken the second curve. And it's cool to have 2, because you can play with them both. But when I was going to make this video, I just read up a little bit on the curves again in Rawpedia, and it turns out that they say that this top curve, the film, like, so you see, you have different methods. These are like different algorithms that will be used to do the curve, and I'll talk about them in a second. But the film like one that is the default here, and the standard one is the default down here, they say that these work well if you use this one, the film like tone curve 1, to darken, and then the tone curve 2 standard to lighten, which is the opposite of what I've been doing. And I find it counterintuitive for some reason to darken my picture first and then lighten it. And for some reason I find doing the opposite makes sense. But since I learned that, I've been playing around, and I find this might work better. Anyway, having 2 curves is what's cool. it's more powerful because, like, you know, sometimes you're playing with a curve and you don't like what's going on, you find it difficult to adjust, just go up to the other one and compensate, right? So having two is amazing. And like I said, they recommend to use this top one to darken and the bottom one then to lighten. And then you can play them against each other a bit. It's fun playing with them. Anyway, so that's the two curves, and then you've got these different methods. And you can look it up at Rawpedia. I've jotted down a few notes here, but, like, you know, for the full explanation, go to Rawpedia. I leave it at the defaults, and I'm gonna now try to do what they say, which is darken and then lighten. But you could do the opposite. You could change that to standard and change that to film-like, and then lighten and then darken, I guess, right? So they say that standard is basically what you would see in most image editing software and in older versions of Raw Therapee, and it's just like the normal tone curve that you would find. And then weighted standard limits the color shift of the standard curve. So the standard curve, if you're used to most picture editing software, if you create like an S curve adding contrast, we'll use the standard one here, it will add contrast, but it will also make the colors look more saturated and intense. And part of that is how human vision works, but it's also happening. Like, the picture is getting more saturated as contrast is added. And weighted standard limits the color shift of the standard curve. I haven't played with it that much, right? But you can play around with it if you want. And then you've got other methods here, like saturation and value blending. They say is good for high key pictures, and it is similar to luminance down here in that you can increase contrast without affecting hue and saturation. And so luminance there, same, right? You can increase contrast, they say, without affecting hue and saturation. Hue and saturation are kept stable, and this will cause, okay, well, let's change to luminance here. You see, it looks desaturated suddenly. They say it will cause a desaturated look, and this is like not actually desaturating the picture. It's just because it's increasing contrast without adding that saturation, and it's not the way your brain works, right? And anyway, they say to mitigate this lost colorfulness, you can go down and use the lab adjustments chromaticity slider. That's what they recommend, and look, it works pretty good. So, you know, if you're going to use that luminance curve, you can mitigate it with that chromaticity slider. I leave these at the default, like I said, right? But and then they have perceptual that says hues stay the same with increased contrast. It won't look more or less saturated than the original. And again, you can use the lab tools down here to fine tune it. And they say that the perceptual curve is also slower. So I mean, if you want to really get into these different algorithms, these different methods for the curves, I would say just play around with them, or go to Rawpedia if you want the full info about them, right? But I leave these at the default, and I play the two curves against each other, and I find it great fun. So after you're done with your curves, there's shadows, highlights, and the highlights here is for darkening down bright highlights, not recovering blown highlights, right? And the shadows tool, like, I'm light on this. I mostly have Canon cameras, and, you know, they don't take as much shadow recovery as some cameras. You can, like, underexpose and, you know, expose for the highlights, and then brighten everything in post. I tend not to do that because I have all Canons mostly. And then there's this tone mapping. this is pretty cool. Like I didn't use this, but recently I've been using it a bit more. I read somewhere, I think it was on Rawpedia there, that, you know, you can turn on this tone mapping, you can adjust the strength of it. I don't find the other controls do much for me, but I adjust the strength, often bring it down a bit, click it on and off. Now this tool is it says here 1-1, and so does this one down here 1-1. Tools that have this 1-1 indication means that the effect that you're seeing here is not really accurate unless you're viewing it at 100%. I find the previews not too bad, but you probably want to check at 100%. You know, if it's critical, only the 100% view will perfectly match your output, you know? This is like more of an approximation, right? So anyway, lately I've been turning on tone mapping and clicking it on and off, and it does brighten things more than I like. So then if I turn that on, after I do, I'll just come up and readjust the curve so that the tone mapping effect isn't too crazy. And then I can go back to like before tone mapping and just see what the tone mapping plus the curve has done. That's a bit much, so I want to darken the shadows even more. But the idea is to do the tone mapping and still not end up with a crazy HDR look. There you go, but with a bit more pop, so to speak, right? Anyway, I don't use it for every picture, and I might not use it for this one. But to demonstrate it, yeah, anyway, if you turn it on and you find it just looks ugly, go up and use the curves to darken it down a bit or something, right? I'm going to turn that off so I can show you the next tool. Not that you couldn't use the two together at all, but this one is dynamic range compression. I think this is also some kind of tone mapping. And again, it's only fully accurate at 100%. I don't find this that big of a deal. But this kind of compresses the dynamic range. I use this one more often, and sometimes it's too strong and it makes everything flat. If the picture is flat, this isn't going to make it look any better, you know? But if the picture is in harsh light, this can help a lot. And this does do a good job with skies and things. And yeah, I forgot to mention up when I was talking about highlights. Like, if the color propagation method isn't working well, try this dynamic range compression. Like, if the picture is, you know, harsh light, this is often the best way to tone it down a bit and recover some dynamic range. It's pretty powerful, right? Try it out. And we're almost done here, I think. Like, there's a vignette filter. This is you know, shouldn't require too much explanation. You can feather it. Feathering at 100% brings it all the way into the center, basically, and you can adjust the strength. And you can sometimes I turn the strength all the way up so I can see what I'm doing to the roundness. And I like to make it a bit more square sometimes, and then I'll bring the strength way back down to something reasonable. One thing that Lightroom used to have that I really like was they had a whites control for the vignette filter that would add the vignette, but it would preserve any whites in it, and I found it looked more realistic. But you know, adding a fake vignette to your pictures is not the most crucial thing, if you ask me. So you know, that's Adobe's advantage. Is not very great there, I don't think, right? So and then there's a graduated filter that you wouldn't use on a picture like this, but you can move it up and down, you can rotate it, and I wouldn't mind being able to add more than one sometimes, right? But Anyway, you can rotate it, you can move it up and down, and you can adjust the feathering, and you can do that in the slider over here. You can make all the adjustments in the sliders, or you can just do it this way, which is what I would do. All right, so graduated filter, turn that off there, and then down here is the lab adjustments, and oops, turn that off. Down here is the lab adjustments. Now now this is the part, I didn't look this up on Rawpedia today like I did with the curves, but lab is just a color space like lightness, and then the A is like, I guess it's like, one is let me see here. Yeah, you see it's magenta green is the A, and then the B is blue yellow, I guess, right? So you have a curve for lightness, and this, like some of the curves we were talking about up above, they should be able to adjust contrast without having a huge effect on your colors, like the RGB curves would. So it's good, you know, for controlling contrast without affecting color. Useful in black and white pictures too sometimes, depending. You can adjust lightness, contrast, and chromaticity down here. Chromaticity is kind of like saturation, but it's not. It's like colorfulness anyway, but you can adjust it. And the A-B curves you would use, like you could use these for like a bit of color correction, like removing a color cast just by taking a bit of green out, or adding, you know, a bit of green or magenta or yellow or blue to the shadows or highlights. And in a lot of pictures, even after you've set your white balance, now white balance is over in the colors tab, we'll talk about that in another video, but in a lot of pictures, even after you've set your white balance, maybe the color still doesn't seem just right, doesn't seem perfect. Sometimes this kind of a color correction can really help with the color separation and make it all look, you know, really good. So these are really powerful, and I used to like do something like this in Photoshop years ago, where you'd have to convert to different color spaces, and, you know, very convoluted way of adjusting these things to remove a color cast. Now it's right here, so it's great. And then you've got lightness according to hue, where you can adjust the lightness of a specific hue, very powerful. And you've got chrominance according to hue, which is similar, but you're adjusting the colorfulness of a particular hue in your picture. And I find both of these, I mean, obviously you can use them for creative effect, but they are also useful in a technical way, which is that if you were doing soft proofing down here, you can enable soft proofing. I don't have my profiles loaded up here now, but if I had my profiles ready and I clicked here, you would see a soft proof of what the print should look like. And then you can enable this out of gamut warning, and it will overlay a warning over the colors that would be out of gamut of the color space that you're printing in. And then you could use this chrominance according to hue and lightness according to hue to tame those colors down until the out of gamut warning goes away, right? And like I said, you could also definitely use them for creative effect. And then you've got hue according to hue, where you could change the hue of a hue, adjust the hue of only one hue, right? And you've got chromaticity according to chromaticity, yeah, where you can adjust the chromaticity of the more colorful parts or less colorful parts according to how colorful they are. And it might be useful, for example, if you had like the reds all clipped and blown out, you might tone down the high chromaticity parts without trying to affect the normal and less saturated parts of your picture. Or you could do crazy stuff with it, you know, if you want, right? But chromaticity according to chromaticity, and then lightness according to chromaticity, where you can adjust how light something is according to how colorful it is. and chromaticity according to lightness, where you can adjust how colorful something is according to how light it is. So you can see, very powerful, and that is just the beginning here. And forgot to mention that you see this is a curve here. You can save the curve, and these other curves up here, so you can save the curve. So let's say I want to save this curve. Okay, sorry about that. You can save the curve as what they call an RTC file, and then apply it to other pictures. And then you can load a curve from a file, and you can copy and paste the curve. So, and especially like Jose said earlier today, you had a bunch of pictures open, or if you know you were working on a big batch of pictures, you could copy this curve and paste it into this picture. Boom. Pretty cool. And anyway, like I said, that's just the beginning of Raw Therapee. That's just the exposure tab. This is the basic stuff. The standout feature that I see here is the two curves and the lab tools. I think it's awesome. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention one of the most important features is these flowers down at the bottom that make the software work better and make your pictures better. Anyway, I hope that helps out. And hey, if you have any tips about the exposure tab here or anything else Raw Therapee, fire me a comment. And next time I'm going to show you the detail tab, and I'll go through one tab at a time. And I got a few other things I want to make videos about too. I want to do one where I just show a bit of the color management, and one where I show the soft proofing. So anyway, until next time, peace.